I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at a writer you and I both really like, Shi Zhecun.
He's kind of underappreciated.
Very underappreciated.
We did a podcast on him with the General's Head,
which was just a fantastic story. So weird.
It's completely psychological, internal. It's entirely, I was going to say it's entirely within the General's head, but that's not actually true. It's within several different people's heads.
This is sort of Shi Zhecun's calling card.
Yeah.
Is all the drama, all of the weirdness tends to take place within a character's mind, which is a new thing. Even in sort of the newer literature written after 1919, very, very internalized psychology is not really a thing.
At the very least, it's not done in a hyper advanced way.
No.
I'm thinking of the most advanced would probably be Sophie's Diary.
Yes,
by Dingling,
which is an actual diary, right?
Well,
I mean, it's not
fictionalized.
Actually, it's written as a
fictionalized diary.
Yeah.
But Shi Zhecun is one of the leading figures in the new sensationalism movement. That's the 新感觉派. And this movement drew off of a lot of literature circulating in Europe, in North America. Japan had a similar movement, the sensationalist movement, that Shi Zhecun and some of his other comrades in modernism, like Li Nao and Mu Shuying, they were all very much plugged into the French way of thinking. In fact, one of their journals was called Les Contemporains. And it is one of the most famous, one of the most influential journals, and in the 1930s, it's being published out of Shanghai. And this story in particular, but all of the stories coming out of this group, they're based in Shanghai.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they're dealing with like a very psychological fiction and also a very urban fiction. They're very much thinking about what the city is doing. And it's also interesting, Shi Zhecun and his comrades, they were writing in a very non-political, political way, or their politics was to be non-political, which was very much a political choice. They founded several journals, many of which were shut down by the KMT, who is ruling over Shanghai and much of China at this time. They're also hated by the communists. They're considered decadent writers. And that's one of the reasons why at the beginning we said that their fiction was overlooked to a certain degree, is because the communists even today really don't like them that much.
Right, because if you're going to have a good revolutionary literature, you want someone who's going to write exposés of how the peasants are oppressed, which is possibly also why when Lu Xun gets canonized, some of his more interesting and peculiar stories just get completely swept off the table.
And this ain't your mama's peasant literature.
This is not. Well, this is, like you said, it's a very urban literature, and there's unapologetic about, I don't know anything. It seems to not know anything about anything outside the city.
Right, and not just outside the city, outside of Shanghai. The world only exists in Shanghai for a lot of this literature.
So this story in particular, which is called One Evening in the Rainy Season, I mean, the plot is a guy walking home in the rain. He comes across this woman without an umbrella. He hems and haws over whether to share his umbrella with her, decides he will.
He thinks it might be an old girlfriend, but it's not clear if that's actually just an excuse for him to weirdly follow after this woman or what.
But the awkward point in the story is right towards the end when she reaches her destination and he tries to talk to her, and she essentially says, "Go away." Like, go back where you came from. Leave me alone, you know.
And then at the end, we learn he has a wife and kids.
We already knew, I think, he had a wife. Yeah. This is something that struck me when I started reading the story, is I got about maybe 30% of the way through and then went, this feels like it could be a story anywhere on the planet, in any city on the planet. And until some of the street markers came up, we could have been in New York, San Francisco, London, Paris, whatever.
And that's part of what's so great about this literature. It's making a claim to bring Chinese literature from a Chinese kind of box, whereas previously it was boxed in as Chinese literature and you can't read it. And this, it's totally approachable. It could be anywhere. This could be any city, because all cities to a certain degree share more in common with other cities, other metropolises, than they do their hinterlands.
Right. There's a certain way of life brought about by the modern metropolis. Metropolis in particular, not just a smaller town or a collection of people, but what the modern metropolis brings about that's sort of universal. And in this one in particular, it's pouring rain. You have someone who is bored with his job. I mean, that's today. You can have that today even. The only difference being, of course, that transportation is a little more arcane in the 20s and 30s compared to now. But like we said, the entire thing is psychological. It's what drama there is his perceptions of things. Is this someone I know? Kind of. Maybe. It looks like her. It could be her. I think it is her. Holy cow. I'm walking down the street with this person I used to go out with. Oh my goodness. This. But, as a reader, we don't know.
And I feel like the man who is the narrator and main character of this story could be anybody. He could be someone you know.
Yeah, just a schlep in a, mid-range job walking home in the rain. I mean, that's
a little bit of a creep, but not such a creep that he can't get by.
This is one of the things that I admire about Shi Zhecun's fiction, is that he's a creep in the sense that he in the actual act he does, which is sort of follow this woman home with an umbrella, that's kind of creepy. But what's going on in his head isn't creepy. He's very nervous. He's just sort of like, who is this person?
Yeah, but
he's more curious than lecherous.
I'm not sure that isn't, and this is part of the great thing about Shi Zhecun's fiction, is even when the narrator is allowing you into his head, it's never clear if you should trust what's going on in his head. Do you actually believe that he's not actually being lecherous, that he's just more curious than lecherous? I don't.
Okay. I can see both being possible.
You're wrong.
Well, you're the one that took a class on it, so you're probably right. But I find it interesting. I think I find the inability to specify interesting. I find most of my favorite fiction is, in fact, that way, where we can have a discussion about, was this guy a lech or not? We can have a debate about it. Shi Zhecun never lets you really settle. I mean,
and that's the sign of good literature, right?
Sure.
Like the fact that we can't come down on any specific side with this literature is fascinating.
And we said before, this is a very Shanghai tale. It's very much akin to some of the things that Zhang Ailing wrote about life in Shanghai.
You mentioned Zhang Ailing. I want to point something out.
Go for it.
The new sensationalist movement, the 新感觉派, that kind of ended in 1934. I want to say their last journal got shut down. Shi Zhecun gave up his position as the editor in 1934, and at around the same time, Li Nao and Mu Shiying, both of whom are the leading members of this group, gave up writing fiction and they turned to just doing editing and criticism. And both of them would die fairly soon after this. Shi Zhecun, he died in 2003. So this movement was in some ways very short-lived. But you bring up Zhang Ailing, and Zhang Ailing is also a writer who's obsessed with the internal thoughts of people and who's writing largely about Shanghai, who's obsessed with urban life. She does some stuff about some works focus on rural life, but they're all crap. If I do say so myself.
That's bold talk for someone who's called her the greatest Chinese writer of the 20th century.
She was writing, thinking about what if communists took over, and she was CYA covering her. Essentially, this movement starts in 1928 and ends in 1934. It has a really long afterlife. Zhang Ailing, as I've said, the greatest of the 20th century Chinese
Except
writers.
for when she's writing rural stuff.
She is dealing with this, though. I mean, she does it differently. Mu Shiying, Li Nao, and Shi Zhecun are all male, and they're very much focused on like dance clubs and like leering at women, whereas Zhang Ailing takes a very feminine turn, and she sort of rejects their masculinity while incorporating some other elements of that. But even if we go beyond that, when we get to the post-cultural revolution writers, they're all struggling. They've been told for all of this time under communism that everything has to mean something, and then they have to deal with just realism. And they're like, they reject that, but they kind of don't know where to go. And so writers like Can Shui, Yu Hua, Mo Yan, and some of the misty poets, they're all going back to Shi Zhecun. They're at least referencing him and touching on him.
Are they referencing him directly?
Not necessarily directly, but they're reading him and incorporating some of his style. So when you go to a poet like Beidao or a poet like Haizi, you can kind of see elements of this fiction in that it's very surreal and you're not really sure what things mean.
See, I would have to differ a little bit because
you're more than welcome to be wrong.
I will definitely correct your mistakes. It's possible that they were reading Shi Zhecun and being influenced by him, but given the way the Cultural Revolution of the party locked things down, the idea of being able to get a hold of copies of Shi Zhecun's fiction, if you're a young construction worker like Bei Dao, it's probably pretty slim. But what I think is more likely is they were probably reading many of the same European sources. If you read Baudelaire, there's lots of passages in Baudelaire's poetry that are just like this encounter, right? This sort of fleeting thing that happens in the rain and you're both gone. The French writer Guy de Maupassant, 19th century as well, lots of his stories work this way. Fleeting chance encounters, and you're never really sure how they're happening.
At the very least, Han Xiaogong and Tan Shui are both familiar with these kinds of Xingan.
There's definitely similarities. I think the idea that they're somehow channeling Shi Zhecun puts a little too much weight on Shi Zhecun's legacy. It's possible, but I think it's more likely they're reading some of the same sources.
Stephen Reep, who's a scholar at BYU, who was my teacher for a day, he says this, and I trust him. So he's saying...
Is this where I make a really disrespectful crack about BYU?
Please do not.
I won't do that.
Me and my wives will get angry. I can do it. I can do it because even though I'm not a Mormon, I went to BYU and I love Mormons. So
all the Mormon listeners are currently tuning out. But there's obviously some shared DNA. I mean, I'm not saying like, oh, they clearly didn't. They're not influenced at all. But any sense of like, everything that came after Shi Zhecun is deeply indebted to Shi Zhecun, I think is a little over the top.
I like over the top, though.
I'm totally shocked.
Let me ask you something. So this is something that I asked while teaching this text. What does the rain symbolize? It's very important. It's in the title, and it's omnipresent as we go through the story. And the whole plot, if you can say the story has something like a plot, is driven by the rain. What is it? Is it desire? Is it kind of like the... Yeah, I take it as desire.
I personally dislike intensely symbols in books.
Like Bob this doesn't actually do literature.
This thing is clearly not symbols. This thing. This thing is something totally different that we're just going to assume is something else. And when you read the symbolists, that is probably true. When I read this, what I find interesting is less what it symbolizes, as though the rain's only there to draw your attention to desire. When I read it, it's interesting because without the rain, the story couldn't happen. And it's also a situation that the rain in this city is a situation that couldn't exist except in a major city. I mean, it could rain in the countryside, but this story wouldn't happen because everyone would just stay inside, right?
And I mean, there's before modernism as a concept comes into China, it would be very, very unacceptable for women to be outside and for a strange man to come up to them and talk to them like this. This is a very modern story in that way. And so the rain drives that.
Yeah, and it's not only the MO, it's what makes the story happen. It almost serves as a commentary in a way, because there's a sense of needing to hide in this story. The guy's hiding under an umbrella most of the time. It's the way you observe things in a city. There's this sense of voyeurism. I'm going to see things, but no one else is going to see me.
It's very Baudelairean, if I will.
Yeah. The joy or the sort of sensual thrill is in not being seen. And that's something brought about by the rain, especially in a city, because there's so many places to hide, not just literally behind walls, but under awnings, under umbrellas.
Hide in anonymity, if you will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. And the thing that it allows social relationships in a major metropolis to thrive is, frankly, anonymity.
I think that's a great place to end it. I guess I should be anonymous, maybe? Or should
it's not raining in the podcast booth. We're good.
Oh, okay. I'm Lee Moore, then.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.